Hello and welcome to this short recording on the organisation and function of the cerebellum and basal nuclei in motor control. So the cerebellum itself, its function, or it's known as the little brain, but its function is essentially to smooth out and coordinate our bodily actions. So it's a function that coordinates dynamic actions. It's quite a complex system with many parts to it. But what we're going to do here is just really simplify it down. Within the cerebellum, we have three different rough locations. First one is at what we call the cerebrocerebellum, and they are these outer sort of lobes. So if you think of it as these outer lobes out here. And the cerebrocerebellum is named because it's receiving descending commands from the cerebrum itself, so the cerebral cortex proper, and it's coming down and into the cerebellum. And so what we have in the lateral hemispheres, or the cerebrocerebellum, motor planning of the extremities. And so what happens is information gets sent down and into the cerebrocerebellum from the cerebral cortex proper. That then helps the cerebellum, that is, helps to then calculate the dynamics of that action, how to appropriately sort of coordinate all the degrees of freedom together, and then sends that back out and up to the cerebral cortex proper to influence the lateral corticospinal tract pathways. So influence the excitability and the drive from the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex. Now the second part is our spinocerebellum. And so the spinocerebellum is this section through the middle here. And so you can kind of think of it near the vermis through these sections. Now the spinocerebellum, as its name is depicting, receives inputs from the spine into the cerebellum. So those spinocerebellar pathways that we mentioned in the previous recording are coming into this location on the cerebellum. And so though the spinocerebellar information is the unconscious or the subconscious proprioceptive information coming in. So it's the proprioceptive happenings in real time coming into the cerebellum. And now the cerebellum can coordinate that plan that was coming from the cerebrum with the actual current proprioceptive happenings. And so these intermediate hemispheres, they're called, help to control the distal limb coordinations. And so once we combine the plan with what is actually happening, we send that out and back up to the thalamus and back up to the motor cortex and the premotor supplementary motor areas to have an influence once again on the lateral corticospinal tract, so those upper motor neurons in that motor cortex. So those two functions, two sort of pathways, are in our schematic as this pathway coming down through the middle and back up through the thalamus, or from the spinal cord coming up and through the inferior cerebellar peduncle and back up through the superior and back up to the sensory motor cortex. And so this loop, as we call it, is very important for the coordination of those distal extremities. The third part is our vestibulocerebellum. And so the vestibulocerebellum is obviously receiving inputs from the vestibular apparatus into the cerebellum. And so you can probably guess that its function is going to be something to do with judging or sensing how the head is moving in space. And that's going to play a pretty big role in trunk coordination and balance and vestibular ocular reflex type coordination. And so that's its function. And so when it then calculates, this vestibulocerebellum calculates all the happenings from the vestibular apparatus, so on, it then sends its information back out back up to the sensory motor cortex, but the upper motor neurons of the anterior corticospinal tract in particular. But it can also have an influence on the reticular formation and the vestibular nuclei to have in the brainstem itself to have an effect on those brainstem motor pathways. More of that later. So if we relate that to our model here, down in the bottom right-hand corner, what we can see is that the cerebellum itself is playing a part in being that comparator, because we have the plan that came down from the cerebrum getting put in, mixed with the current proprioceptive happenings. So that's the actual state, what we are actually seeing compared to our internal model. So the desired state, those two can be compared to each other. And also that then can sort of give us an idea about some of that error, the error signal in our movement patterns that then can come back and affect the inverse model, or that desired state. That is the cerebellum in a nutshell. Now, when we talk about the basal nuclei, also known as basal ganglia in many texts, but basal nuclei is the proper term, we're talking about a number of structures within the cerebrum itself. And those structures are our caudate and our putamen. Together they're known as the striatum. Globus pallidus externus and internus, the purple ones here. Our subthalamic nucleus, and then also our substantia nigra, pars compacta and pars reticulata parts, both parts. Now, all of those structures together are known as the basal nuclei. What's the function of the basal nuclei? Well, basically, it's another really complex neural calculator that helps to control movement. And what parts of the movement are they controlling? Well, basically when to start and stop movements, when to ramp up the intensity or ramp down the intensity of our actions, so that, and also the direction of our voluntary actions. So what we're referring to over here in our schematic of the nervous system is this loop here. We're coming from our sensory motor cortex in particular. We're going down into the basal nuclei structures, which we've just talked about here. We send that information back to the thalamus back to the sensory motor cortex to have an influence on the final motor command being sent down. When to start and stop, how to regulate the intensity, how to regulate the direction of our movements. Now, when we talk about the function of the basal nuclei, well, how do we ramp up the intensity, or how do we turn on and off actions? It's done through dynamic interaction between the direct and the indirect pathways. Now, I don't want us to get overwhelmed with this schematic in the middle here. Essentially, it's like a little loop. And if we talk about the direct pathway firstly, I want to draw our attention to the globus pallidus internus segment. And so this one here, the globus pallidus internus, which we can see over here on the left-hand side, these two purple structures, tonically fire back onto the thalamus, but it's an inhibitory input. So what happens is it's tonically firing, so it's going bang, 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 bang onto our thalamus. If we are inhibiting the thalamus, we then reduce the amount of excitatory drive back onto the motor cortex in the frontal lobe. If we're reducing the amount of excitatory input, then we're obviously ramping down. But that's not what the direct pathway does. We've got to go right back to the start. And so what you'll notice is that substantia nigra and the cerebral cortex itself have large excitatory inputs onto the caudate and putamen, the striatum, which are the two orange ones here. So if we're driving down onto the caudate excitatory inputs, they actually then, the caudate and the putamen, inhibit the globus pallidus. If we inhibit the inhibitor, it leaves the thalamus free to drive excitation back onto the motor cortex. So the net effect of this pathway is excitation back onto the motor cortex. So now you can start to understand how we drive the intensity of our actions up. The indirect pathway, you'll notice this loop is the same loop. So we still have that same loop functioning. The indirect pathway is actually referring to this part here, this additional loop on the side, as well as the cerebral cortex inputs onto the subthalamic nucleus. So what it does is essentially we have the subthalamic nucleus that drives onto the globus pallidus internus segment, which we just said will inhibit the thalamus. If we're exciting that inhibitor, it drives this inhibition. If we drive the inhibition onto the thalamus, less excitation. So we get a reduction in the excitation onto the motor cortex. And this is controlled via other loops or additive effects of other loops, such as the cerebral cortex itself driving down excitatory inputs onto our subthalamic nucleus, which increases the excitation onto the globus pallidus, which then increases the inhibition of the thalamus, which then decreases the amount of excitation going to the frontal cortex, or the motor cortex in particular in this case. If we also drive inhibition of our globus pallidus from the caudate and putamen, we then inhibit this inhibitor, which then means that there's less inhibition of the subthalamic nucleus, more excitation onto the globus pallidus internal, more inhibition. So once again, we get a ramping down of the amount of excitation. So in essence, when we talk about our direct pathway, what we're talking about is driving up the excitation, excitation, onto our motor cortex. When we're talking about the indirect pathway, which is this component and also the influence of this component, then we're actually ramping down the amount of excitation back onto the frontal cortex. So now that helps to explain how we ramp up the intensity or down the intensity, how we then modulate perhaps the direction of our actions, and also how we then decide to start and stop actions. So that was a brief overview of the cerebellum and the basal nuclei and their role in motor control. Thanks for listening, and talk to you soon.